All right. So let me talk a little bit about myself. Since we're talking about Christians in the workplace, I thought it would be prudent for me to talk about what influenced me in my work as a Christian, as a kind of introduction to who I am, how I work, and the kind of person that I am. How many people have read Where the Redfern Grows? Okay. You guys might not get this in the back. Where the Redfern Grows is this story about this boy. Is it Billy, I think? And he really wants hound dogs. He gets 2 hound dog pups. He names one Old Dan and one Little Ann. And throughout the course of the book, his mother and father encourage him to pray for these dogs. And he really thinks the answer to prayer is him getting these dogs. And through the course of the book, and if you haven't seen it, I'm going to spoil it for you. Through the course of the book, he actually used these dogs to go coon hunting, and he sells the skins, and his parents have this hope that someday they can move from the country into the city so they can have a better life for their kids, for their son, Billy. And their concern is that Billy's going to just be so enamored with these dogs that he's never going to want to leave the countryside. And I always got in my head that somewhere in the book the father says, pray like it depends on God and work like it depends on you. And through research for this class, realized that's nowhere in the book. So somewhere in my young adult life, someone made that statement in connection with this book, and I've linked these two things together. But it's really interesting because multiple times in this book, it's the mother or the father encourage Billy to pray and encourage him to work hard in order to achieve his goals. And there becomes a crisis of faith when at the end of the book, the devil cat shows up, essentially a mountain lion, and threatens Billy's life, and his 2 pups essentially save his life. And he loses these 2 dogs that he's worked a couple years for. He saved up all this money for. It's one of the 2 things I've ever cried at. I've cried at Where the Redfern Grows, and I've cried at Up. Those are the 2 things I've ever really cried. Well, it was more an emotional breakdown sitting outside of Disney World, but that's completely different. So one of my work influences has been that book, this idea that work like it's up to yourself, pray like it's up to God. And we could probably teach an entire class on that, mainly just the philosophical and theological ramifications of that, and whether or not it's something that we should hold on to as Christians. The second thing about me and my work influences, one of my first jobs I used to work, well, let's talk about my first job. My very first job, I used to work in the meat department of the second best, i.e. the last grocer in Weiser. There's 2 grocers in Weiser. And his name, my boss's name was Paul. He owned the grocery. And he was the kind of guy that when you killed a deer, you took your deer to Paul, and Paul butchered it for you. He did a lot of that for the entire city. And my job was to clean the meat department for Paul. And so every single night, I'd clean the bandsaw, and I'd clean the grinder, and I'd clean the smoker, and yeah, it was a dirty job. The second thing about my work influences, when I used to work for a government contractor, and this was like the second job out of college I had. And I used to write software for the Navy, and one of my bosses was a guy named Ron, big barrel-chested Italian guy, Ron Fascio. And when I gave my resignation, we just had a heart-to-heart. And when I was moving on to another company, he's like, Adam, if I can give you one piece of advice, he's like, find the stinkiest job and make it smell good, and you'll always have work. And it's something I've always kind of held on to. So whether that was, I used to unload truck at McDonald's. No one wanted to do that. No one wanted to wake up at 5 in the morning and meet the truck at McDonald's and unload it. Whether that was cleaning the bandsaw at the meat department, whether that was fixing other people's poor code, or whether that was a difficult client or impossible goal, I've always kind of focused on the smelliest job and trying to make it smell great. So that's something about me and my work influence. Let's talk about God's biblical foundation of work. Can you turn in your Bibles to Philippians chapter 3, verse 17 and 21? Philippians 3, 17 and 21. Good night. I realize I left my phone in my car too. Man, I am just batting 1,000 today. Would someone like to read Philippians 3, 17 through 21? All right. So before we talk about work, we need to talk about citizenship. In our country, work is typically tied to citizenship or nationality. Do you guys know what the H-1B visa is? Anyone want to tell me what an H-1B visa is? It is. It is a work visa. It's usually a visa used by companies when a company says, I can't find an underwater welder in the United States in Virginia, I'm going to apply for an H-1B visa in order to bring somebody from outside the country with these skills to Virginia specifically in order to do underwater welding or some sort of specialized skills. It's not supposed to be used for non-specialized skills. It's supposed to be used for specialized skills. The reason I know this is Accenture, the company I used to work for, is like the second largest requester of H-1B visas in the country. They think software development is such a specialized skill that they need to import a lot of workers from other countries in order to fill their need. So when we talk about work, we have to talk about citizenship, because it's citizenship and work for us is tied together as a country. What is the difference between citizenship and nationality? There is a difference.
Citizenship is more of a documented formal thing. Nationality is where you're from or where you're born.
Yep, right. You can also think of it in the New Testament standard. There were Roman nationals, people that were a part of the country of Rome, but they weren't like Paul. They weren't born in Tarshish. They didn't have the citizenship of Rome. They weren't Roman citizens. They weren't protected by the Roman laws. Remember, Paul got beaten by a Roman centurion, and Paul's gambit, Paul's trump card he pulled out was, hey, I'm a Roman citizen. What did that centurion do? He about lost it, because he's beating a Roman citizen who hadn't had a trial yet. Because of his citizenship, he was afforded specific protections. The same is true for us. In Philippians, it says that we are citizens of heaven, not of earth. Has anyone, I know you have, has anyone worked in a foreign country before? Taylor, where did you work? How did you feel about working in Japan as an American citizen? Okay. Right. What does the word gaijin mean? Foreigner. How many times did you hear that? A lot. Taylor and I share something. We've both lived in a foreign country and worked in a foreign country. Have you lived in a foreign country?
Yeah, I also was living in Japan.
Were you teaching English too?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So you've felt this too. There came a point in time in my career in Japan where I realized I'm a foreigner. I'm not going to get the kind of responsibility and the kind of control over my job because I am not a citizen. Does that make sense? That there comes a point in time where you realize this job is not going to be as fulfilling because I lack a citizenship in Japan. And I think there's something to be said about that when we talk about our work and where our citizenship lies and working on earth versus our citizenship in heaven. So keep that in mind, and that'll come up in my classes as we move forward. Okay, so any other questions? Do you have anything else to add about citizenship, living and working outside of America?
I think it just, like, having that experience of not being a citizen makes you appreciate your citizenship so much more,
Yeah, it does.
which I think kind of relates to everything. I think, not having something makes you appreciate what you do have.
Right. I'm opinionated about Japanese ministry, missionaries, and just the idea of working in Japan. There came a point in time where I was flying back from America back to Japan after actually going to my sister's wedding. I was about 20, she was 19 at the time. And Japan's a very homogenous society. It's very easy to tell when someone isn't Japanese because they don't look Japanese. And so it's really difficult as a missionary to go to Japan and convince people of the gospel because you're an outsider. You have a word called gaijin that you're labeled with, and you're from the get-go labeled as you're not going to understand Japanese culture, you're not going to understand Japanese experience. Yes, you're going to be, if you want to do tea ceremony, great. If you want to wear kimono, great. If you want to do all these things and experience culture, that's wonderful. But the bonds of trust that are required in order to share the gospel with somebody, it's going to be really difficult for me to create those kinds of bonds of trust with a native Japanese person. And there came a point in time where I realized, okay, I need to stop spending my time trying to minister to unbelieving Japanese people, and I need to build up believing Japanese people so their relationships with other non-believers are strong. That my job in Japan is going to be to encourage the Japanese Christians so that they can encourage their Japanese friends, because they're going to be much more successful in bringing people to Christ than I would be. And it's, once again, that idea of citizenship. I didn't have citizenship. I barely had nationality in Japan. And what Paul says in Philippians is that I feel we should have the same sort of idea. We should not have citizenship on earth. We should barely have nationality on earth. Our citizenship should be in heaven, and we should be focused on that. Okay, let's move on. Okay. Oh yeah, the last thing I said, there's one, can you guys name the one role where citizenship is really key in our government? Called what's that? Taxes. That's correct. There's one role you can't have in this country unless you're a citizen. Yeah, why is that? Exactly. Not just citizenship. There are people that come to this country, they might be, like Arnold Schwarzenegger was not born in the United States. He was born, I think, in Austria, Germany, one of those locations. He could be governor all he wants, but if he wanted to be president, he wouldn't be allowed to be president because he wasn't a natural-born citizen. All right, so there's this idea of birthright citizenship as well, or at least natural-born citizenship. And then there's also birthright citizenship, where you can be president if one of your parents is. Birthright citizenship is questionable. And I bring that up because my wife may or may not be able to be president because she's born in Canada, but she has a American mother. So it's legally up in the air. Okay. All right, let's move on. We're to talk about work in the Old Testament. We're going to actually work Old and New Testament. We're going to look at people in the Old Testament. So let's start with Abraham. And if I had a slide, I'd show you this lovely picture of a 1650 painting of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, but we don't have that. Tell me, what was Abraham's jobs. What were his professions? Do you remember? There's one role like most of the people in the Bible had. Yep, I just heard it. What was it? Tent making. Close. It's shepherd. Yeah, it's shepherd, herdsman, rancher. Abraham's a herdsman. He's a rancher, a shepherd. We also consider him a prophet. Joseph. Tell me about Joseph. How did he start out life? Shepherd. Where did he go from there? The dungeon. He ended up being a slave. From there, what else did he do? What got him out of the prison? A dream reader, an interpreter. From there, he ended up becoming a vizier. I'll use vizier a couple times. You'll hear the term vizier. Whenever I think of vizier, I think of Jafar from Aladdin. Like, not all viziers have to be evil and with pointy beards. Vizier is where we get the word advisor. They share common roots. A vizier is often a royal advisor. He was also a magistrate, so he would actually oversee. You think about Daniel or Joseph. Didn't he oversee food for famine, or was that Daniel? I get these two mixed up. It was Joseph. Okay, so he's also a magistrate. So he administer similar roots as well. So he administered that food. David. What was David's profession? Shepherd. Okay. And from there, king. There was a couple of steps between there.
Musician.
He was a musician. I didn't have that one. That's right. He was a court musician. He was on the run. I wrote down rebel for that. So he was a rebel. He was a warrior. So Saul was upset because the people greeted Saul and David home from battle, and what'd they say? Saul's killed his thousands, David's killed his tens of thousands. We know David was a warrior. He was a rebel. He was a king. All right. Daniel. What about Daniel? We're getting past the kingly lines and into the diaspora. What was Daniel before he was moved to Babylon? Before he was moved to, was it Babylon or Syria? Nebuchadnezzar, I know this the king. He was technically a noble. Daniel would not have picked up the rabble of the street and put them in the court of the king. They would have taken nobles from Jerusalem and picked them up and moved them to Jerusalem. And so what we know about Daniel is he's probably a noble to begin with. And from there, what did he do? Similar to Joseph. He interpreted dreams. He was an interpreter and also, again, a magistrate or administrator. What about Esther? This list is a little bit lighter than normal. Esther is a queen. Okay? And then additionally, I would say she could probably be considered an advocate. Right? She makes a good case for her people not to be killed by the king. What about Deborah? Who's Deborah? She's a judge. Deborah's also a military leader. Okay? She is finding and convincing men to join battle. And she's also a recruiter, I would consider. All right? All right. Can you think of anybody else on that list? I can think of a couple. Any other notable characters on that list?
Deborah was a prophetess too.
Prophetess as well. One of the things my wife and I talked about as I was, finishing up the class and didn't want to go back and change anything, was Hannah. That Hannah was a mother. She didn't end up being queen or king or magistrate or admin, but she did have a job in raising Samuel, and that son ended up affecting the. Samuel ends up anointing David, and David ends up. No, is it David? Samuel anoints Saul and David, and then Solomon builds the temple, right? So through this line, Hannah is either indirectly or directly, depending on how you think about it, the building of the temple because of her son. Okay. So in general, how did God use these occupations? Say, for example, Joseph and Daniel and Esther. How are these occupations used by God? Yeah. Okay. We studied, not Nebuchadnezzar, Nehemiah last Tuesday. And you read the first chapter of Nehemiah, and you see the way Nehemiah talks to the king of, is it Assyria? Babylon? And Nehemiah is the cupbearer. He is the person who gets to taste the wine of the king before it touches the king's lips, just to make sure it's not poisoned, right? And Nehemiah makes this plea to the king for his country, for his wall. And it's very deferential. It's very, no, he doesn't make a plea to the king. He makes a plea to God, sorry. He's used to speaking to the king. Nehemiah is used to being in front of the king. He's used to being deferential to himself. And you see him talk to God. And the way he talks to God is, I have sinned. My people have sinned. If it's good, please find favor in your servant and give us what we want, which is to go back to Jerusalem, right? It's because of his role under the king that I think he's partially successful in bending God's ear, because he knows what it is to be deferential to the king, right? Think about back to Samuel. When Samuel anoints a king, God says, these people aren't rejecting you, Samuel, as prophet. They're rejecting me as king. And here's Nehemiah going back and talking to God as though he was a king. And it's because of his role in that position that he knows how to talk to God that way. All right. What about, now, I think about David. And I think about, or Joseph. I think Joseph might be a better example. Daniel might be a good example too. We have examples of Daniel in the lion's den. We have examples of Daniel in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel chooses not to eat the courtly food, the kingly food. He chooses to eat what? Right? The vegetables. He chooses to maintain the diet that he had in Jerusalem, and he's better for it. Joseph, he was that shepherd. He gets, put into slavery. We have Potiphar's wife trying to tempt him. He's thrown into jail. He interprets the dreams of the king's cupbearer and the king's baker, right? Which then leads him to be able to interpret the king's dreams, and then leads him to a position. These guys really only used their faith in God once they became magistrates and admins, right? And kings? No. There's this consistent, constant pattern that they're using their faith in God even when they're shepherds. David killing bears and lions. He's using his faith in God to protect his flock. And then when he goes and kills Goliath, he's using that same sort of faith, right? When Saul asked David, why should I let you try to kill Goliath? He's like, well, I've protected my flock from lions and bears, and God's protected me then. God will protect me now. This is while he's still a boy. He probably hasn't gone to war yet. He's only protected his flock up to this point. But he's willing his faith is pushing him towards trying to defeat Goliath. Yes, ma'am.
When you're talking about these things, I'm thinking about the difference between kind of like pushing your thoughts and ideas onto other people versus those thoughts and ideas come out because of who you are. And it feels like, I mean, from what I'm seeing in the Bible, it seems to be more effective when that's because of who you are rather than because you're trying to affect a change or trying to, steer. It's just who they are. Do you guys see that too?
That their character is directing their actions. They're not trying to be strategic with their actions, or okay, yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I doubt Daniel was thinking, you know what? My good eating here is going to make me physically fit and better against my peers, right? He's not thinking about the outcomes. He's thinking about what he's been called to do, right? Which is leading to good outcomes. Is that?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about it in terms of, like, as people, a lot of the time we're told, we're encouraged, go out and change the world, go out and make a difference. And so many of these people, their purpose wasn't to make a difference.
Right.
The difference was made because of who they were.
Right. Well, I also think your goal is to change the world, but you can't change the world unless you change the people around you and then the community and move slowly out from that. I know that's not what you're talking about. I don't even think that maybe it does fit with what you're saying. Like my also thinking is, you set a goal. I want to do X, Y, and Z. Right? I want to go live. One of my goals someday is to live in Japan again. There are so many intermediary goals before I get to that, and I can always say, well, that's just in the future, and never work towards it. Right? I don't think David's goal, I don't think Daniel's goal, I don't think Joseph's goal was to be magistrate. They didn't, take care of sheep out in the plain and kill lions and bears thinking, oh, someday I'll be king, right? They were applying godly principles to where they were right now, which led to something else where they applied godly principles, which led to something else where they applied godly principles. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, like we would say God is working through them, and through their character. I'm just contrasting it a lot to how I sometimes feel there's so much push for us as people to develop ourselves and to have these goals and to affect the world around us. And sometimes I wonder if we would just be more effective if we worked on our character and serving God and let Him work through us and see what happens.
Yep, I agree. From my perspective, I'm more concerned about being a Christian and being different, mainly because there's aspects of being a Christian that I can display that are just radically different than the way people are acting in my workplace. And being radically different sometimes means radically different results. And I think that's part of what you're seeing here, is they're acting in ways that are against the norm, and not in bad ways, right? But in good ways. I think a good example of that is when you look at this idea of servant leadership within the corporate space, saying, hey, I want to make sure that the people I work with are empowered to be able to do their jobs, that I'm not there to micromanage their work. And there's great articles and books that talk about applying this idea of Christian servanthood to the workplace. And when that is successful, not only does that mean, hey, end up being a good leader, but that also means, hey, when someone says, you do things differently, why? Oh, well, you heard of Jesus? Right? It's easy to start those conversations. Okay. All right, can someone turn to Exodus chapter 31 for me? This is one of my favorite verses. Exodus chapter 31, verses 1 through 10. Actually, I've got it right here. Let me just read it. We're running low on time. At least I think I am if I have my phone. All right. Then the Lord said to Moses, "See, I have chosen Bezalel, son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and have filled him with the Spirit of God, with wisdom, with understanding, with knowledge, and with all kinds of skills, to make artistic designs for work in gold, silver, and bronze, to cut and set stones, to work in wood, to engage in all kinds of crafts. Moreover, I have appointed Oholiab, son of Ashimach, of the tribe of Dan, to help him. Also, I have given ability to all the skilled workers to make everything I have commanded you: the tent of meeting, the ark of the covenant law, with the atonement cover on it, and all the other furnishings of the tent, the table and its articles, the pure gold lampstands, all its accessories, the altar of incense, the altar of burnt offering, and all of its utensils, the basin with its stands, and also the woven garments, both the sacred garments for Aaron and the priest, and the garments for his sons when they serve as priests." I can ask. I have conclusions from this verse. What conclusions do you guys have from this verse before we get into my conclusions? What is God taking credit for?
Supplying talent to people to accomplish different jobs.
Yeah, exactly. And are these talents evangelical in nature? No. Are they some of them menial in nature? Yeah. Some of them are menial. Some of them are very artisan-like. I first encountered this verse when I went to Worship Leader Institute 3 years ago, and Keith Lancaster said, you guys have a gift in music, and you should consider it God-given, and this is why. And he points to this specific verse. That if God gives talents to build a temple, why wouldn't God give talents to men and women to praise him? And he made similar assumptions about the musicians. We learn about the musicians inside the temple, the people playing music to praise God within the temple, writing the Psalms. There is talent there, and it's given by God. The next question comes, so what? When are we not doing the next temple raising, right? We don't build temples anymore. Why would the author of this study bring up that verse? We don't build temples. Why would we think God giving us a talent is important? What was the temple? The temple is described as like the footrest of God. This is where his presence dwelled. This was supposed to be the glory of God. What was the Ark of the Covenant, right? You look at the Old Testament, in the book of Samuel, specifically, the people think the Ark of the Covenant is God, and so they take the Ark of the Covenant into battle, and what happens? They lose it. And then God, strikes plagues on the Philistines of tumors and rats. And so the Philistines give back the Ark of the Covenant with golden tumors and golden rats, saying, "We're sorry, please take back your God." Right? The Ark of the Covenant and the temple are these earthly ideas of where God is dwelling. They are for the glory of God on earth. And God has given people talents so that his glory can be recognized on earth. Why is God giving us talents? And can we make the same conclusions that he's giving us talents so that we can glorify God on earth as well? Okay.
I also feel like
Yeah, go ahead.
when I think about like what I want in my career, and like glorifying God in that career, I'm not going to be an evangelist. So I think for me, thinking about how to bring that into my life is just like, how do I contribute
Yeah. I think early in my career, I thought, I want to make sure the decisions I make at work is not giving my faith a black eye. Right? That's to me, that's the lowest hurdle I tried to jump. Make sure that when I interact with people, when I made decisions, when I was seen at work, at least people didn't say, well, he's a Christian. He shouldn't be acting that way. And I think from my perspective, I'm constantly trying to upgrade that position to not giving a black eye to the question of why is Adam doing it that way. The other thing is, and this is really difficult. Like I've heard stories from mentors within the church about, well, I was a manager at such and such bank, and I just invited my employee over to dinner, and I talked to him about the Bible, and he decided to be saved. And I'm thinking, boy, there's so many like managerial issues with that. Like I don't want that person to feel like the next promotion they get is based on whether or not they come to church with me. Like it's really difficult. Also from like a discrimination and from a managerial perspective, from a discrimination and preferences, you know this, you've gone through the Intuit training, right? There's this idea of retaliation and preferences. I cannot look like I retaliate against one person and prefer another person. I have to treat everybody equally, right? And so there's part of me that wants to invite people to church and I want to get them involved, but at the same time, I don't want to make it look like I'm using my influence over them to get them to come to church in the hopes of a reward. But at the same time, I want my actions to influence them. I want the way I manage them to influence them. But it's really weird. Like I can influence them and then hope somebody else steps in.
I think that's what Rebecca's talking about, is that it's hard to, by living your life, you hope to influence. That it is super hard. I struggle with that too. Like how can you bring people in an outward way? And my parents and I talk about that a lot. And it's, well, you're doing that for hopefully your husband and your kids and the people that you work with. So it's more of a indirect versus a direct. Because I struggle with that too. Like how does that not just come off totally weird?
Right.
You're talking to your neighbor but by knowing them knowing who you are, you're hoping that connection and that relationship.
Right. And from my perspective, I feel like I'm just opening doors with the people that I had at my last company because I'm not in a position of authority. I'm not in a manager position. I still have relationships with them. And now I'm in a different company and I'm talking to them saying, you know, I've been talking to Zach. Zach and I have a friend that Zach works with, and Zach is hesitant to invite him to church. I think because he still works with him, but I don't. I feel like I'm at a point where I can ask him freely without him concerned about, well, you know, if I say no, is Adam going to retaliate against me? Or if I say yes, does this mean I get a promotion next quarter? And I'm outside of that cycle. I've built a good relationship with him because of work, and I feel like I can talk to him now about Christ. Yes?
I was just thinking, like, kind of going off of that, a great way to, for me, I think, is praying that God opens those doors and that you are able to people resist your actions.
All right. Was that the first bell or the last bell? Okay. I saw my wife in the back of the room, and she's supposed to be teaching class too. So, all right. And then let's talk quickly about New Testament. There are two things we can look at in the New Testament, specifically about Paul. There is inference and commandment. Do you guys know when I say inference and commandment? We can infer something that Paul did as a good idea or maybe even a rule, and then we can look at what Paul told us to do as a commandment. So there's a difference between inference, seeing how Paul lived his life, and commandment, actually taking Paul at face value what he says. We have examples of Paul. Let's see here. We're going to skip the actual people. We're going to go look at Lydia and Eurydice and Luke and Manaen. We're going to skip those because of time. Paul himself. Let's look at some examples of Paul. So this is the inference. Acts 18, 1-3. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus. And that's class. So we can talk about that later. Who's doing next class? You know, John? Is that you or Zach? All right. Conclusions. What Paul really does here is he ends up, you see in Paul's examples, one, he is a minister, but at the same time he's concerned about making sure that his ministry doesn't bog down financially the people around him. So he's a tent maker. He takes care of himself. Multiple times in his letters he says, you know, you should listen to me, not because I'm in it for financial gain, because whenever we were with you, I fed myself. Whenever we were with you, I worked for myself. We did not burden you financially. I'm not in this game, and I'm paraphrasing now. I'm not trying to reach out to you in the gospel in order to get money for myself or in order to make your church strong so you'll support Jerusalem, because I've taken care of that myself in my work. I'm here to influence you because I believe in the gospel. I think that goes back to what we were talking about. We should be removing doubt from people's minds about our motives, right? Our motives as managers, our motives as employees. I think if they see consistent action, and that consistent action is God-focused, there's not going to be, well, you were God-focused in regards to here, but then you weren't God-focused in regards to here. You were God-focused in regards to bringing me to church, but you weren't God-focused in regards to my promotion or this thing over here. And so, if anything, I think the conclusion here is wherever we are, if we're applying the same godly principles, we end up being above any of that repute, above any of that scrutiny. And we apply the same principles everywhere. In the sense that Paul did, he sidesteps and skirts concern about motives because he was consistent in the way he acted. Too long, don't read. There you go. All right. Thanks so much, guys. All right. Awesome.